The more radical version, though, does. And the more radical version is this: even those who are exposed to Christianity and who have heard the gospel are not necessarily required to believe it. They can be forgiven even if they reject Christ. How so? Well, maybe they've been so deeply influenced by circumstances and cultural biases that they do not have the psychological freedom to take the gospel seriously. I mean, for all we know, they may be rejecting the gospel, and here I'm going to use a phrase that quite a number of those who hold this view have used, through no fault of their own. Maybe they're rejecting the gospel through no fault of their own. And if they're doing it through no fault of their own, how is it that God can hold them responsible then? Maybe they had bad experiences with Christians. So when they hear the Christian message, they reject because of those bad experiences. Maybe they're so deeply indoctrinated by their own view, Hinduism or Islam. Maybe their families are such that there is such social pressure for them not to change that they don't give the gospel a fair hearing, and certainly God would not condemn them in those circumstances, the thinking goes. Now, this second version of inclusivism is actually the inclusivism, the official view of the Roman Catholic Church. And those of you who've been on board with Stand to Reason's broadcast for a while, I'd say for like 15 years or longer, know that in the early years there were many discussions on this issue because I was doing a radio program called Religion on the Line as a guest with Dennis Prager and a rabbi and a Roman Catholic priest and a Protestant minister. And there in that discussion, I was stunned to find out that every single priest that came on that program that was there to represent Roman Catholicism to the people listening, including a bishop, Bishop Blair in particular, held this view. Held the view that even those, for example, the rabbi sitting there at the table with us doing the show, who had actually heard the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, they were not obliged to believe it. In fact, I remember the very first show that I did, Father Michael Nacita was the priest. Christian called in to, in a sense, witness to the rabbi, and before the rabbi can have a chance to respond, Michael Nacita said, "Hold on, Rabbi, I'll take this call." And he jumped in as the Roman Catholic Christian to upbraid the Protestant Christian for attempting to witness to the Jewish rabbi, which Jewish rabbi didn't need Jesus. Now, I had been raised as a Roman Catholic in the Vatican I tradition, was not that familiar with Vatican II, and I almost fell off my chair. That was the first time, it wasn't the last. Every single Roman Catholic priest on that program had the same view. So I think you can see that the modest inclusivism is somewhat benign, but the second, what I'm calling right now radical inclusivism, I think this is far more insidious. That's why it can make me so angry if I'm not careful. The reason is this, like the pluralism, that it ends up looking exactly like it actually hinders the proclamation of the gospel. And I saw that on the radio show, when, in this case, the Roman Catholic priest got in the way of someone preaching Jesus to the Jewish rabbi. He said the rabbi doesn't need Jesus. And when I had Vivian Ben-Lima, one of those priests, on my own program to talk specifically about that issue, Vivian having just come from the Vatican where he had spent 2 years studying ecumenism, in other words, broadly this question. Not only did he defend the view of inclusivism, but when I asked him, please, to tell me the name of a false religion, just pick one out, the notion was almost incoherent to him. He struggled for a while and finally said, well, I can only think of two examples. And I'm thinking, what are they going to be? Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism? Here are the two examples of false religion that he gave me: secularism and Satanism. In other words, secularism and Satanism were the only two worldviews that he could bring himself to condemn, given his own Roman Catholic inclusivistic views. Now that strikes me as very odd, and it makes the point, I hope, why I am so concerned about this second form of inclusivism, regardless of who offers it, whether it's Rome or the emerging church, or the emergent church, or whoever it happens to be. Because it seems to me that this view actually hinders the proclamation of the gospel, because if you think about it, there is no circumstance where one could say that any particular individual must believe in Jesus. Where is that circumstance? You can't talk to people of other faiths and say, you're making a mistake, you have to believe, because they don't on this view. If they are rejecting through no fault of their own, as if that's a real category, it's another question I'll address at another time. If they're rejecting for those reasons, then they're not responsible. We don't know who is, of those who reject, are rejecting through no fault of their own. One could always imagine some kind of scenario that would, exonerate the person. Oh, he had a tough upbringing. He had bad experience with Christians. His parents were nasty. Evangelicals or Christians are hypocrites. So, you think, fill in the blank. He's deeply convinced that Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism are true because that's what he was raised with. He's not capable of seeing. Well, you can always imagine that. And under this view of inclusivism, what is the incentive, really, for communicating the gospel to anyone? And especially if such a thing is politically incorrect, this is a wonderful cover, isn't it, for not sharing, for not standing and taking the heat the way the disciples did for this very message. Now, all I wanted to do at this point is just clarify inclusivism for you. In the subsequent weeks, I'm actually going to give biblical arguments against it, both the weak and the strong form, the weak and the radical form, or the modest and the radical form, I should say. I think both are mistaken, but the weaker form is more benign, and I'm much more sympathetic to that, though I don't think it's biblically justified. But the stronger form goes completely and directly and aggressively contrary to the explicit teaching of Scripture and turns out to have the same debilitating impact as pluralism has for the gospel. And that's why we all should be concerned about it.